In this video, we're going to talk about enabling internet access in our network environment using the Palo Alto firewall. Now, if you see my prior videos where we've talked about firewalls, we've previously been talking primarily about using Cisco routers or other devices using access lists. These access lists, for the most part, rely on what's called the 5 tuples. And the 5 tuples is the basic inspection of the network packet to determine whether we should allow it or deny it in our environment. The 5 tuples are the source IP and source port, who's sending me this data and from which port. Then destination IP and destination port. What destination is it going to? Which server and which application? And then lastly, which protocol is it running on? Is it IP? Is it TCP? Is it UDP? Is it ICMP? What other protocol might be available for that system? We can go ahead, using these 5 tuples, go ahead and determine whether we should allow or deny traffic in our environment, and the default is deny. If you're following along in my class, you've gone ahead, you've set up some firewall or some rules in your environment, you've configured your IP addresses, and nobody could access the internet. Why can't I access the internet? Well, the default is to deny, and we've never told it otherwise. So if our environment looks similar to this right here, basically what we want to do is we want to allow the private VLAN right here to be able to access the public VLAN, because it's not in the diagram here, but right there is the internet with a default gateway of .1. So we want to allow these guys to come through the firewall out to the internet. By default, we are denying that, so we need to enable that. Now, if this was the standard Cisco access list, we would then look at a spreadsheet such as this, and we would say, okay, we want to permit source IP. The source IP in this case is the private VLAN, which is the 10.1.0.0/24 network. Source port, well, actually, we want all ports to be able to access it, so I'm going to put a star just to describe a wildcard or an all. Destination IP. Ooh, what destination is it? Well, it's the internet. The internet is pretty much everything. So again, I'll put in a wildcard, and then which ports? Pretty much every port out on the internet. Protocol, do we want TCP, UDP, ICMP, OSPF? Actually, we want all of them. So I will just put IP. And so that's what the rule would look like if this was a Cisco device, if this was a standard access list. I say Cisco device, but ASAs and other far more advanced firewall devices are more complex. Standard access lists, it would look something similar to this, with our 5 tuples being in play. All right, well, that's great, you say. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's set up our firewall and let's configure it to allow that network out. But that's for an access list. That's not for a Palo Alto. A Palo Alto device suddenly has more than just the 5 source IP, destination IP, ports and protocols. Now we have, what type of rule is this? What zone are we coming from? Who is doing it? Is this a URL we want people to access to? Do we have antivirus running or file blocking? What's the schedule for this user? All of these protocols, all of these rules right here, all join together as one big giant and. So if I am inspecting my traffic and I say I only want this type of rule for this zone, for this IP and this user, with this application going to these URLs, with this vulnerability protection, all of those have to line up for me to be able to allow the environment or to allow the data through. You can see it starts getting really, really complex. However, the great thing is, it's still this. It's still our 5 tuples. We've just got more than just 5 to look at. Well, let's check it out. How we do this in our Palo Alto, basically there's 3 steps. Very first step is to create a security policy rule. The security policy rule says, yes, you could do this. This is the default deny right here. That's where we say, yes, you could do that. The second step is a NAT policy rule. Now, when you think about the internet, you think I have a private network inside my environment, such as a 10.something. 10.x addresses are not accessible from the internet, therefore we have to use some sort of a NAT program or NATing tool in order to access the internet. Lastly, test and monitor the traffic, make sure it goes through, and then rinse and repeat as necessary. So let's check that out. Let's go ahead and try to do this. I have my virtual environment right here. Let's go ahead and log into that. There we go. So I've got my virtual environment here. I have gone ahead and I've installed Chrome just because I like Chrome. It seems to work a little bit better for me anyway. The very first thing I want to do is I want to create a security policy. Now, you're probably looking at our tabs up here up at the top and saying, oh, security policies, that might go under policies. And you would be absolutely correct. So for policies, we click on our policies tab. And then over on the left-hand side, we can see we have our security, NAT, QoS, forwarding, decryption, inspection, and other policies all identified here. Sweet. So we go ahead and we select security policy. You'll see that there are 2 default policies right here. One is called an intrazone and the other interzone. Intrazone, things staying within the same zone. So for instance, if I have 2 different zones that are both doing desktops, how should I allow, one zone with 2 interfaces? Yeah, one zone with 2 interfaces. There we go. For desktops, should I allow or deny traffic? Well, I scroll all the way over to the right, and the default action for intrazone is allow. After that, interzone. Should I allow zone A to be able to talk to zone B? And the default action for that is deny. So I need to create a new zone. As you can probably see down here at the very bottom, there is an add button. Why is the add button grayed out? There we go. The add button down here allows me to create a new zone. At this point, like I said, there were so many different options for us to choose from. Which ones do we start with? Well, the kind of rule of thumb is we start at the left and we work our way to the right. All right, so security policy rule. What do we want to call this rule? I'm going to call this permit internet access. Actually, not just permit internet access. I'm going to solve permit private to internet access. The rule type. Do I want this to be an intrazone or an interzone? Or do I just say universal, which allows me to do both? I'll say universal. Description. I could put some sort of a useful description in here, so that when I look at this again in 6 months, I will be able to remember exactly what this means. And then, of course, apply any tags appropriately. So that's the general tab. Source. All right, so here we can see we could choose from a source zone and source addresses. And we can also click the any checkbox. I don't want to choose the any because I don't want just any zone to be able to access the internet. I want specifically my private zone in order to access the internet, or to be able to access the internet. So I'll click add, and then I see my zones right here. I've got my private zone. That's the one I want to allow. I could further restrict this with source IP addresses. So for instance, source addresses, excuse me. So for instance, my entire private VLAN right now is the 10.0.0.0/24 network. I could go ahead and I could choose that as my option. However, so what that means is if I further expand my private zone in the future and it's not included in this /24 network, they won't apply to this environment. To keep things simple, since I want everything in my private zone to be able to access the internet, I'm going to go ahead and delete that and have the any IP address in the private zone be able to access this. Next tab, user. We'll come back to this in the future, but I could specify which users and which computers can access the internet. Really quickly, you'll notice that destination right here has a little squiggly at the bottom of it. That means there's a required section that we have to put in there. There's something that we actually have to put in there we can't ignore. As opposed to like application and service and actions, we could ignore those. But destination, the little squiggly there, means I have to put something in. So let's go check that out. In this case, the selection is, what is my destination zone? At least one destination zone has to be in there. I said where I can go from. Now I'm going to say where I want to go to. So let's go ahead and say add. Which destination zone do I want it to go to? I want it to go to my public network. I want the private network to talk to the public network. Great. I can be more specific and say what destination addresses do I want them to go to. So for instance, if there's a specific server I want them to access on the internet, I could click add and I'll specifically allow them access to that one IP or range of IPs or group of IP addresses on the internet. In general, the internet is a really, really big place and I want to do everything. So I'm going to leave it to just any. Next tab, application. Which applications do I want to access the internet? Well, if this is just standard application traffic that I want, I've probably got like HTTP, HTTPS, and DNS. Maybe there's more that I want to be able to access the internet, but right now, those three applications sound pretty good. I mean, pretty much if you're not web browsing or web browsing over a secure connection or querying DNS to be able to find IPs, you're doing something weird on the internet 99% of the time. Now I say 99% of the time because I always do weird things on the internet. So this rule would mostly apply to me, but I might need some exceptions in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and say add. Which applications do I want? And there is a ton of applications here. Palo Alto has gone through and they have evaluated all of these applications. There's so many, in fact, we don't even get out of the B's before it says, you know what, you have to start filtering. We just can't show you anymore. Well, the very first one we said was HTTP. It's not that simple. It's not just HTTP because which HTTP? It's actually called web-browsing. There we go. Web browsing. I will check that one. That one actually is our HTTP web browsing applications. The second one we said was HTTPS, and you might immediately think, well, if the first one was web browsing, is the second one web browsings with an S at the end? And no, that would be wrong. But it would be funny, but it would be wrong. The second one is actually called just plain SSL. Right there, SSL. You can see it looked for anything that says SSL, like cross loop, a missile, and SSL. SSL is the one I want. And then lastly is DNS. DNS right there. How do I know what these are named? Well, I've done it before and I've done some Googling before to make sure I found the right ones. So there we go. Those are the three applications I want to be able to use while accessing the internet. Let's go over to service/URL category. I could further define which services I want to come in here, and this oftentimes has to do with specific ports that I want to be able to access the internet. And then I can also specify which URL category. So when I'm web browsing, do I want to allow, say, gambling? Or election season's coming up. Do I want to allow political websites? Maybe, maybe not. I can allow or disallow them in this URL category section. For right now, I'll leave that blank. And then the Actions tab. Which action do I want? I want to allow this. That's awesome. I want to log this at the end. You can log it at the beginning or you can log it at the end. You get more information if you log at the end. I could go into other settings such as log forwarding and schedules and QoS and antivirus and all these kinds of fun things. There we go. Antivirus, URL filtering, and so on. For right now, I'm just going to leave that as none. So we'll say OK, and there's our rule. Now, the great thing about this interface is you could quickly see my source zone is private, my destination zone is public, and if I keep scrolling over, there's my applications, and services is defaults. Defaults basically means look at the if I look at the DNS, by default this runs on port 53 UDP and 53 TCP. So service defaults means for DNS, those are the ports to expect. SSL, expect port 443. Web browsing, expect port 80. And then action is allow. So I could quickly and easily see all of my security policies all on one side, and I know that I have to do everything on this line at the same time. Remember, it's an and. I have to come from the private zone and go to the public zone and be one of these applications and run on the default ports. And with that's done, I will be allowed. Whew, man, that's a lot of work. Okay, so that was setting up our security policy. Now, when we think back to our network diagram, we remembered that we are in the 10 dot something range. We cannot access the internet with a 10 dot something range. This would allow, very quickly, this would allow me to route traffic. So with this one rule, I could route from my private zone to my public zone without any issue. However, because I'm on the 10.1.00/24 network, that cannot be accessed on the internet, so I have to come up here to the NAT policy and configure a NAT policy to translate that traffic for me. Let's check it out. There's no default NAT policy, so I'll go ahead and I'll start with a new one. Again, down at the bottom, just click Add. And at this point, it's very similar to the security policy. In fact, it's so similar, you may think you are duplicating your efforts. Sometimes you kind of are. Again, just like previously, if it has the red squigglies underneath, that means it has a mandatory configuration. This last one doesn't have a squiggly, but you do actually have to do something to make it work. So for the NAT policy, I'll go ahead and call this NAT private to public. Description, tags, NAT type. Original packet. What's my source zone? I can go ahead and say private. Did I name that right? Yeah, private to public. Okay. Source zone is private. Destination zone, public. Destination interface. Which interface do I want it to go out? Well, I know my interface is actually 1-3 that I want. Services, any services. Source addresses, destination addresses, I'm going to leave those as they are. Again, I could be more granular. Just as I was with the security policy, I could be even more granular with my NAT policy on top of that. We then look at translated packet. Do I want to translate based off the source address or the destination address? It gets confusing. Almost always you are using source NAT. And almost always you're choosing dynamic IP and port. We could get into why that would change in the future, but for right now, we'll leave it at that. Address type, we could do a translated address, or we could say specifically use the address that's on the interface. That's the easiest one to do, so I'm going to go ahead and choose that. Which interface? Well, that's Ethernet 1.3, and then that has an IP address right there. All right, so at that point, I will save that and I will commit it, because remember, until we commit it, it is still a pending configuration. Whew. Okay, we're almost there. We've almost got it. At this point, we are actually ready to begin testing. So I've got another machine right here. This is my Active Directory machine from my network diagram. And let's go ahead and log in. Logging in as administrator. My super secret password 01. And at this point, this should... Ooh, look at that. We actually saw it happen. If you've never noticed before, this little icon down here tells me my network status. It previously had a yellow triangle on it saying something wasn't quite right. I couldn't quite reach the internet. In the amount of time that we were talking, it had the triangle and then disappeared, which means it started out thinking something was wrong, and now it's working. So I should be able to open up a web browser and start browsing the internet. Yeah, don't worry about any of that. I'm going to go ahead and just go to Google. Yeah, ignore all that. Why did it not allow it? It probably didn't allow because I said ignore. This is one of the reasons why you don't browse the internet on a server. There we go. So we've got some... There we go. I'll just ignore all those messages. Now we have a web page. Look at that. We've been able to browse the web page. This is an HTTP. We could actually do an HTTPS. I will go ahead and go to my web page, my website. Yes, SSL is fine. And it should... There we go. Lots of every single web page you go to, whether it's your own or not. There we go. So we've got our web pages, both HTTP and HTTPS working. The fact that we're able to resolve the names, go away. The fact that we're able to resolve these names to IP addresses means DNS is working. So our three rules that we've created, HTTP, HTTPS, and DNS, are now working. Just to show really quick, those rules we created may not have been complete. For instance, if I tried to ping google.com, it goes ahead and it gets the IP address, which means DNS. It then tries to ping and it is timing out. And the reason was because when we set up the rules, we did not allow ping as one of the applications to go through. So we could go back in, we could change the rules, we could allow ping. I'll worry about that another day. Okay, so we've gone ahead. For our private VLAN, we have created a security policy that allows private to the internet. We then created a NAT policy that allows private to the internet. I also want my DMZ to be able to access the internet. So let's go ahead and do that. This private to internet policy is actually like 99% of what I want. Really, the only change I want to make is this right here. I want this to be DMZ. Now there's two ways I could do that. I could actually edit this zone and I could add the DMZ zone to that policy, to that rule. The other thing I could do is I could come down here and I could click clone. And I could create a new policy that's based off of that one, but now uses the DMZ zone instead of the private zone. That is probably going to be a lot more granular in the future. Allow me to have different policies for my private network as opposed to my DMZ network. So that's what I'm going to do. I've gone ahead, I've highlighted this record. I didn't click on it, I just highlighted the row. I click clone. It says, sure, do you want this to be at the top, at the bottom, after the... I'll just leave it as is. And say okay. So it created a permit private to internet access -1. Everything else is the same. Let's go ahead and edit that. We'll change this permit private to permit DMZ and get rid of that -1 at the end. Source, no longer private. I only want that to be DMZ. Everything else in this case is exactly the same. So now I have one rule for my private network and another rule for my DMZ network. Awesome. Halfway there, I need to do the same thing for the NAT policy. I have a NAT policy private to public. I will highlight that, clone, edit the clone, and we'll go ahead and rename that NAT DMZ to public. Original packet, change the source zone to DMZ. The destination zone all stays the same. The translated packet all stays the same. Okay, and commit. And it's just that simple. Once you get it set up for one network, you basically just copy it for another network. Again, the great thing about copying it as opposed to just simply adding it in as another source zone is I can now go back and be more granular. For instance, in the security zone for my private, I could come back in here and I could now specifically say, you know what, only specific users can access this. Or I can come back and I can start adding in additional applications that shouldn't be running in my DMZ but are running in my private network, such as ping. Is it called ping? I think it's called ping. There we go. So I can start adding in additional policies, additional options for the individual zones and make it more granular accordingly. So there we go. Enabling internet access. Pretty simple when you start going through the process, as long as you know exactly what the process is. Number 1, create the security policies. Policies allow routing. Number 2, create the NAT policy, which allows translation of the addresses. Oh, number 3, test and monitor. You know what? We tested the traffic. We never monitored it. We'll do that really quick. If we come back to our virtual machine, there we go. I'm actually going to cancel out of that because I don't really want to save that. In order to monitor the traffic through the Palo Alto, there is a monitor tab right here. And ooh, look at that. Our traffic logs have already started filling up. So we could quickly and easily see, hey, look, we had some traffic from the DMZ zone to the public zone, and it was allowed. We can even see what type of traffic it was, what its destination, and then even what rule allowed it. There is a lot of different monitoring in here. For instance, threat monitoring, URL monitoring, and so on. There is actually a unified monitor down here at the very end. If you get super excited and you really want to start looking through this, for instance, SSL, you wanted to find all the SSL traffic. If I click on this, you'll notice it actually applies a filter automatically right here. Application is equal to SSL. I then click apply, and suddenly it should filter out my list and only show me SSL traffic. So we created the policies, we created the NAT rules, we tested the traffic from the client as well as then monitored it from the Palo Alto. When we were done, we repeated that for our DMZ zone because we only really have the 3 zones in this configuration. But we repeated it, and the repeating process made life a million times easier.